Rain fell in thin silver lines over the highway outside Ashcroft, the kind of rain that made headlights blur into halos and made drivers slow their breathing without noticing. Officer Travis Holloway sat in his patrol car, with the engine idling, watching taillights pass like a man counting cattle before slaughter. He had done this so many times that his hands no longer shook, his pulse no longer rose, and his conscience, if it had ever existed, no longer whispered anything at all. When the black Audi passed him doing 3 miles over the limit, he did not hesitate. He flicked on his lights, pulled out behind it, and felt the familiar, comfortable thrill of a man who already knew how the story would end before it began. The driver pulled over without drama, signaling early, easing to the shoulder, with the kind of composure that most people lost the moment red and blue lights appeared behind them. Travis approached the window with his flashlight raised, expecting fear, expecting apology, expecting the usual parade of nervous hands and shaking voices. Instead, he found a woman in her late 30s, dressed simply in a gray coat, her hands resting on the wheel at 10 and 2, her eyes meeting his without blinking. Her name, according to the license she handed him, was Dr. Nyla Voss, 39 years old, address listed 2 counties away. She did not ask why she had been stopped. She did not offer excuses. She simply waited, as though she already understood something Travis did not. He told her it was a routine stop, a taillight issue, nothing serious, just a formality before he let her go. It was a lie he had used 100 times before, smooth and rehearsed. The kind of lie that worked because people wanted to believe the world was fair. He asked her to step out of the vehicle so he could take a look inside, and she complied without protest, standing in the rain with her arms loosely at her sides while he circled toward the trunk. What she could not see, what no one ever saw until it was too late, was the small plastic bag he slipped from his jacket pocket and tucked beneath the spare tire cover in 3 practiced seconds. It was a motion so smooth it looked like nothing at all, the kind of sleight of hand a magician might envy, except this trick had ruined dozens of lives before hers. The highway itself seemed to hold its breath around them, the nearest exit nearly 4 miles away, the nearest gas station, a faint smear of light on the horizon behind a curtain of falling rain. Travis had chosen this stretch of road deliberately over the years, not because it saw heavy traffic worth patrolling, but precisely because it did not, offering just enough isolation to make his methods invisible while still technically counting as an active patrol route on his shift log. He had learned that confidence, more than any actual evidence, was what made an arrest stick, and few things built confidence faster than working somewhere no one else was watching closely. Standing there in the rain, watching Nyla's calm expression through the sedan's rear window, he felt nothing resembling doubt, only the familiar, comfortable rhythm of a routine he had perfected across more traffic stops than he could accurately count. What he failed to notice, distracted by his own performance, was the faint red light blinking from a small device mounted discreetly on a utility pole nearly 200 yards up the road, a device that had been installed there only 6 days earlier under the guise of a traffic monitoring upgrade. He also failed to notice the slight change in Nyla's breathing the moment he approached the trunk. Not fear, but focus. The quiet intake of breath belonging to someone watching a plan they had rehearsed 100 times finally began to unfold in real time. The rain continued falling steadily around them both, indifferent to the enormous weight the next few minutes would carry, indifferent to the fact that one of these 2 people believed themselves fully in control of the night, while the other had already written its ending months before it began. He straightened up, feigned surprise, and called out that he had found something concerning. Nyla walked over slowly, looked into the trunk, looked at the bag, and then looked at Travis with an expression that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. There were no tears. There was no panic. There was only a quiet, unreadable calm, the kind usually reserved for people who already knew how a chess match would end several moves before their opponent did. She asked for his badge number, her voice level, almost gentle, as if she were asking for directions rather than facing an arrest that could destroy her career and her freedom. Travis smiled the way he always smiled at moments like this. A practiced smirk meant to remind people who held the power. He recited his badge number without concern, because in 12 years on the force, No one had ever done anything with that information except grow more afraid. He cuffed her hands behind her back, guided her into the rear of his cruiser, and radioed in another success story for the department newsletter, another dangerous substance kept off the streets, another arrest that would make him look like a hero in front of superiors who never asked too many questions. He did not notice, or perhaps did not care, that Nyla spent the entire ride staring out the window, memorizing the route, the mile markers, the timestamp on the dashboard clock, filing away details, the way a woman does when she is not a victim at all, but an observer waiting for her moment. The station that night carried its usual smell of burnt coffee and old paperwork, fluorescent lights humming over tired desks where officers filled out forms they had filled out 1,000 times before. Travis walked Nyla through booking with the casual authority of a man performing a routine he could do in his sleep, narrating details to a young officer at intake as though he were teaching a masterclass in procedure. What struck the young officer, and what would later strike several others, was how still Nyla remained throughout the entire process. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand a phone call to a lawyer, though she was entitled to one. She sat in the holding area, with her hands folded, watching the room the way a scientist watches a controlled experiment unfold exactly as predicted. A female officer named Denise brought her a cup of water and, out of habit more than curiosity, asked if she was doing okay, since most people in her position were either sobbing or shouting by this point in the night. Nyla accepted the water with a small nod of thanks and said she was perfectly fine, that there was nothing to worry about. Denise pressed gently, asking if she wanted to call someone, a family member, an attorney, anyone at all. Nyla only smiled, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes, but instead seemed to sit somewhere deeper, somewhere calculating. She said there was no need, that everything would resolve itself in time, and that patience was simply a tool most people forgot how to use. Denise found herself unable to shake a strange feeling as she walked away. The sense that she had just spoken to someone who understood the entire situation better than anyone else in the building. She mentioned it later to a colleague, half joking, asking why the woman in holding kept smiling, like she knew a secret nobody else did. The colleague laughed it off, assuming exhaustion or shock, the kind of numbness people sometimes fell into after a frightening arrest. But Nyla was not numb. She was cataloging faces, badge numbers, camera angles, exit routes, procedural violations, and timestamps, building a mental file with the precision of someone who had spent years trained to notice exactly these things. She noted, for instance, that the intake camera above the booking counter had a small blind spot near the doorway, a detail an ordinary detainee would never think to observe, but one that mattered a great deal to a person building a case. She noted which officers signed which forms, which supervisor initialed the property log without actually inspecting its contents, and which digital timestamps did not quite align with the handwritten entries beside them. None of it seemed urgent in the moment, and to anyone watching her, she appeared to be nothing more than a quiet, cooperative detainee waiting out an unfortunate night. In truth, she was assembling the skeleton of a much larger structure, one detail at a time, the way a mason lays brick without needing to see the finished building to know it will eventually stand. At one point, a sergeant walked past her holding area and remarked to another officer that the woman seemed strangely educated for someone caught with contraband, noting her posture, her vocabulary, and the careful way she phrased even simple requests. The other officer shrugged and suggested she was probably just good at hiding her nerves, the way some people learn to do after years of bad luck with the law. Neither of them considered the far simpler explanation, that she was not nervous at all, because she had never actually broken any law in the first place. It was a blind spot baked into the department's culture, an assumption that anyone sitting in that chair, dressed the way she was dressed, driving the car she had been driving, must have done something to deserve it. That assumption, more than any single planted bag of contraband, was the real foundation Travis Holloway had built his career upon. Near midnight, when the booking area had quieted and only a skeleton crew remained on duty, another officer leaned against the doorway and asked Nyla, almost mockingly, why she seemed so unbothered by facing serious charges. She lifted her eyes to meet his, unhurried, and answered in a tone so calm it almost sounded kind. She told him that someone had just made an extremely expensive mistake, and that mistakes of that particular size rarely stayed hidden for long. The officer laughed, assuming she meant her own mistake behind the wheel that night, and walked off without a second thought, never imagining she meant something entirely different. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Travis Holloway had a long and quiet history stretching back nearly a decade. A history built on convenient discoveries and manufactured evidence. It had started small, a planted item here, an exaggerated report there, each incident justified in his mind as necessary policing in a city that rewarded arrest numbers over truth. Over time, the habit calcified into a system, one he refined with two other officers who shared his appetite for shortcuts and his contempt for anyone who might slow them down with questions. Together, they built a quiet routine of falsified paperwork, coerced statements, and selectively edited reports, protected by superiors who cared more about crime statistics than the people behind them. Word around the department was that Travis Holloway could smell trouble before it happened, that his instincts were sharper than any other officer on the force, and that his arrest record proved it beyond doubt. What his colleagues did not realize was that instinct had very little to do with it. His arrests were rarely instinctive at all. They were engineered, timed, and staged with the same careful choreography he had used earlier that night. He had learned which judges asked few questions, which prosecutors were overworked enough to accept a report at face value, and which victims were unlikely to have the resources to fight back. Nyla, on paper, looked exactly like the kind of target he had chosen 100 times before. A lone driver on a quiet road with no witnesses and no obvious protection. The pattern had begun nearly 12 years earlier, back when Travis was still a young officer eager to prove himself in a department that measured worth almost entirely in arrest quotas. His first questionable stop had involved a teenager driving his father's car home from a late shift, a boy who had done nothing more than roll through a stop sign on an empty street at 2 in the morning. Travis found a small amount of contraband in the glove compartment that night. Contraband, the boy's family always insisted, had never belonged to him, but by the time anyone thought to question the report, the boy had already accepted a plea deal out of fear rather than face a trial he could not afford. It was a small, forgettable case in a city full of similar cases, the kind that vanished into a filing cabinet and never resurfaced, and it taught Travis an early lesson about how easily the system could be shaped once someone understood its blind spots. From there, the habit grew slowly, deliberately, each incident slightly bolder than the last, each one justified in his own mind as necessary policing rather than outright fabrication. He began keeping small quantities of confiscated substances from previous arrests, rather than logging them properly into evidence, storing them instead in a compartment beneath his cruiser's spare tire, ready to be used again whenever a convenient opportunity presented itself. Two other officers, drawn in by shared ambition and a mutual understanding that questions were bad for careers, eventually joined his routine, splitting responsibilities in a way that let each of them claim plausible deniability if anyone ever asked too many questions. A detective named Ruiz began quietly overlooking irregularities in exchange for a cut of money flowing from a separate smuggling operation the group had come to protect rather than dismantle. A lieutenant named Cobb learned to sign off on reports without reading them closely, understanding that his signature was worth more to certain people than his scrutiny ever could be. Over the years, the group refined its methods further, learning to select targets who fit certain unspoken criteria, people whose word was unlikely to be believed over that of a decorated officer, people unlikely to have the resources or the connections to fight back through the courts. They avoided targeting anyone with an obvious public profile, anyone with a large family capable of organizing outrage, anyone whose case might attract press attention beyond a single paragraph buried deep in a newspaper. It was a quiet, patient form of predation, disguised entirely as diligent police work, celebrated publicly through commendations and awards, while privately corroding the trust of an entire community. Travis kept a small drawer in his home office filled with newspaper clippings, praising his work evidence of a hero narrative he had constructed so thoroughly that even he seemed to believe it some nights, forgetting the quiet architecture of lies holding the entire persona together. But something about this particular night refused to follow the pattern. By early morning, without any clear explanation offered to the officers on duty, word came down that Dr. Nyla Voss was to be released, her charges quietly set aside, pending further review. No one in the building understood why, and no one thought to ask too many questions, since paperwork errors and administrative holds happened often enough in a department already stretched thin. Nyla collected her belongings at the front counter with the same unshaken calm she had carried all night, signed the release forms without complaint, and walked out into a morning where the rain had finally softened into a fine mist. She did not go home. She did not call a friend or a relative to vent about her ordeal. Instead, she walked half a block to a parked sedan that was not the Audi Travis had searched, climbed inside, and placed a single call using an encrypted line that connected to a secure operations desk many miles away. Her voice, still calm, still measured, carried an authority that had been absent from the persona she wore inside the station. She spoke only a handful of words into the receiver, confirming that the target had behaved exactly as predicted, and that it was time to move the timeline forward. The words she used were simple but unmistakably deliberate. The operation code, named Iron Veil, was now active. The following morning arrived with an unusual stillness inside the department, the kind of quiet that settles over a building right before something enormous happens, without anyone yet knowing it. Officers filtered in for the early shift, exchanging the usual gossip about overtime and paperwork, unaware that their entire precinct had already become the subject of a federal investigation 8 months in the making. Around 9 o'clock, a line of black government vehicles rolled into the parking lot with a precision that immediately drew attention from every window facing the street. Uniformed officers gathered near the entrance, murmuring questions among themselves, wondering if this was some kind of unannounced audit or inspection. Doors opened in unison, and a team of federal agents stepped out wearing dark jackets marked with unmistakable lettering, moving with the calm efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact entrance many times before. The department captain hurried out to meet them, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he processed the sheer number of agents now filing into his building. At the center of the group, stepping out last from the lead vehicle, was a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, her federal credentials clipped visibly to her jacket, her posture radiating an authority entirely different from the quiet passenger she had appeared to be the night before. It took Travis nearly 10 full seconds to recognize her face beneath the change in clothing and bearing, and when recognition finally struck, the color drained from his skin as though someone had opened a valve beneath him. It was Nyla, no longer dressed as a stranded driver on a rainy highway, but standing before the entire department as Special Agent Nyla Voss, lead investigator of a federal task force assembled specifically to examine corruption within local law enforcement. She scanned the room slowly, her eyes eventually settling on Travis with an expression that held no anger, no triumph, nothing but calm and total control. She greeted him simply, using his rank and his name, her tone almost pleasant in its precision, and the sound of her voice seemed to hollow out whatever confidence remained in his chest. Every officer in the room understood, in that single moment, that whatever was coming next would not be resolved with excuses or badge numbers. What the department did not yet grasp, and what would only become clear over the following days, was that Nyla's presence the previous night had never been an accident. For 8 months, federal investigators had been quietly assembling a case against several officers within the precinct, focused on patterns of falsified evidence, wrongful arrests, and a financial trail connecting certain officers to a smuggling operation moving through the region. They had gathered documents, financial records, and testimony from previous victims too frightened to come forward publicly. But they lacked the one thing that could turn suspicion into an unshakable case: direct, undeniable proof of an officer committing the act itself, captured cleanly and admissibly. Nyla had volunteered to become that proof. Knowing Travis Holloway's patterns from months of surveillance, understanding his preferred routes, his preferred targets, and the specific hours when his confidence made him careless, She had arranged to be exactly where he would find her, on a road with just enough isolation to feel safe to him and just enough coverage to be devastating in court. Every choice she made that night, from her calm posture to her simple questions, had been designed to draw out his exact method without ever tipping her hand. She had worn no wire because none was needed. Instead, an entire invisible network of cameras had already been quietly authorized and positioned along that stretch of highway weeks in advance, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of encounter that occurred. The preparation behind that single night had taken weeks to finalize, involving a small team of analysts who studied years of Travis Holloway's patrol logs, cross-referencing them against complaint filings, court records, and financial statements pulled through federal subpoena. They noticed that a disproportionate number of his most celebrated arrests occurred on the same 3 roads, always late at night, always involving drivers who traveled alone, always resulting in searches that somehow produced exactly the kind of evidence needed to justify the stop after the fact. They built a probability model predicting which nights he was most likely to patrol that particular stretch of highway, factoring in shift schedules, weather patterns, and his documented tendency to grow bolder during storms, when visibility dropped and witnesses became scarce. Nyla had reviewed the model personally, memorizing every detail of his known habits, until she could predict his movements almost as well as he predicted his victims. She had trained for weeks beforehand, not in the traditional sense of physical preparation, but in the quieter discipline of remaining still under pressure, of allowing a hostile situation to unfold exactly as it needed to, without reacting in a way that might compromise the operation. Behavioral specialists had coached her on breathing techniques designed to keep her heart rate steady even while cuffed and searched, understanding that any visible panic might have altered Travis's behavior in ways that could undermine the very evidence they needed him to produce. She had rehearsed her exact words, including the simple request for his badge number, chosen deliberately, because it was disarming enough to seem harmless while also placing his identity clearly on record from the earliest possible moment. Every element of the encounter, however spontaneous it appeared to Travis in the moment, had been considered and reconsidered by a team determined to leave no opening for a defense attorney to later exploit. That morning, in a conference room commandeered by the federal team, Nyla addressed the assembled officers and staff with a laptop connected to a large display screen. She explained, without raising her voice, that everyone in the room was about to see footage compiled from multiple independent sources, each one corroborating the other, in a way no defense attorney could later dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. The first video came from a traffic camera positioned nearly 200 yards down the road, capturing the entire stop from a wide angle that showed the sequence of events with chilling clarity. The second came from a gas station security camera across the intersection, angled just enough to catch Travis at the rear of the vehicle during the critical moment. A third video, more damning still, had been captured from the dashboard camera of a passing civilian vehicle whose driver, unaware of any larger operation, had simply been filming the rainy road for a personal recording and happened to catch the stop in the background. A fourth source came from Travis's own body-worn camera, which he had apparently forgotten to disable during the crucial seconds, perhaps out of the same overconfidence that had protected him for years. A fifth and final piece came from an aerial surveillance drone, quietly deployed by the federal team, its footage crisp enough to remove any lingering doubt about what viewers were witnessing. Frame by frame, the screen showed Travis approaching the trunk, opening it, and in one fluid motion, placing a small bag beneath the spare tire cover before closing it again and stepping back to feign discovery. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the projector fan became the loudest sound present. Several officers exchanged glances, some suddenly pale, others visibly trying to distance themselves physically from where Travis stood, as though guilt might be contagious. One young officer near the back audibly exhaled the word unbelievable, though it was unclear whether he meant the crime itself or the fact that it had gone unnoticed for so long. Travis opened his mouth as if to argue, to claim the footage had been altered or misrepresented, but the words died somewhere in his throat as Nyla calmly continued, through 5 more incidents pulled from months of archived footage, each one following an eerily similar pattern. It became evident within the hour that Travis Holloway was not the only person in the building whose name would soon appear in federal paperwork. A lieutenant who had signed off on dozens of Travis's reports without scrutiny sat frozen at his desk, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. An internal affairs investigator who had dismissed prior complaints against Travis as unsubstantiated found himself summoned into a private room down the hall, his voice trembling, as agents laid a folder in front of him, containing records he had never expected anyone to find. A detective who had accepted unexplained cash deposits over the years watched his own bank statements appear on a screen, projected with the same clinical detachment Nyla had used moments earlier for the traffic footage. Federal agents offered each of them the same simple choice, framed without threats, without raised voices, delivered instead with the quiet finality of people who already held every card in the deck. Cooperation, they explained, could mean reduced consequences and a chance to demonstrate accountability before the full weight of the investigation landed. Silence, on the other hand, would only ensure that when the case moved forward, no leniency would be extended to anyone who had chosen to protect the network rather than expose it. The lieutenant broke first, agreeing within the hour to provide records connecting several years of falsified reports to specific dates and specific victims who had never received justice. His statement led investigators directly to 2 more officers whose names had appeared repeatedly in overlapping incident reports. By early afternoon, the internal affairs investigator followed, offering testimony detailing years of dismissed complaints, buried paperwork, and quiet instructions from supervisors to make certain cases disappear before they attracted outside attention. Word spread quickly through the department that the walls were closing in, and within days, 3 additional officers approached federal agents independently, each hoping that early cooperation might soften whatever punishment awaited them. The department that had once operated like a fortress of mutual protection began collapsing from the inside, officer by officer, confession by confession, until the full outline of a corruption network stretching far beyond a single traffic stop came into focus. Travis, watching his former colleagues abandon him one after another, found himself increasingly isolated, his allies evaporating as quickly as his credibility. He spent those early days making phone calls that went unanswered, leaving messages for men who had once called him brother in arms, men who now let his calls ring out rather than risk being overheard speaking with him. His own attorney warned him plainly that continuing to contact former colleagues could be construed as an attempt to influence testimony, a warning that only for the first time in 12 years, Travis Holloway understood what it felt like to be the one without protection, without a system quietly working in his favor, without a badge number that made people afraid to ask questions. Detective Ruiz was among the first to fully break, arriving at the federal building without even waiting for his attorney to join him, insisting that he needed to speak immediately before he lost the nerve to do so. He described, in exhausting detail, the exact mechanism by which cash moved from the smuggling operation through a series of shell accounts before landing quietly in envelopes, handed off in parking garages and diner booths. He named dates, amounts, and the specific phrases used between the men involved to avoid ever saying anything incriminating aloud, a code built from casual small talk that agents had already partially decoded through months of wiretap evidence. His cooperation implicated not only Travis and Lieutenant Cobb, but also a mid-level businessman named Walter Prentice, whose import company had long served as a convenient front for moving product through the region undetected. Lieutenant Cobb held out slightly longer, protected by a misplaced confidence that his rank alone might shield him from the same consequences facing the officers beneath him. That confidence collapsed the moment agents presented him with recorded conversations pulled from a listening device planted months earlier inside his own office, conversations in which he could be heard instructing subordinates to misplace certain evidence logs and to steer particular cases toward friendly prosecutors. Faced with the recordings, Cobb's composure cracked entirely, and within an hour he was providing names, dates, and account numbers with the same eagerness he had once used to defend the very system now being dismantled around him. Each new confession opened another thread, another name, another account, until investigators found themselves working through nights, just trying to keep pace with how quickly the network was unraveling itself. What struck many observers most was not the scale of the corruption, though it was substantial, but the speed with which loyalty evaporated once the possibility of individual survival entered the equation. Men who had spent years protecting one another, who had built careers and friendships on a foundation of mutual silence, turned on each other within days, once federal charges became a tangible threat rather than an abstract fear. It was as though the entire structure had never been built on trust at all, but on convenience. And the moment that convenience disappeared, so did every bond that had once seemed unbreakable. Nyla observed the unraveling from a careful distance, understanding that this particular collapse required no further intervention from her, only patience, while the machine she had set into motion continued turning under its own momentum. Refusing to accept the inevitable, Travis retained a defense attorney known locally for aggressive tactics and a willingness to challenge law enforcement procedure at every turn. The attorney filed motions claiming entrapment, arguing that federal agents had manufactured the entire scenario specifically to trap his client, and insisting that Agent Voss had violated proper investigative boundaries by placing herself directly into the encounter rather than observing from a distance. He argued in press statements, carefully worded to avoid direct falsehoods, that the entire operation smelled of federal overreach designed to embarrass a hard-working police department rather than pursue genuine justice. For a brief moment, some in the community wondered whether the attorney's claims held merit, uncertain how much of the story they were truly being told. Nyla addressed these accusations not with anger or defensiveness, but with the same composed precision she had shown from the very beginning. In a formal hearing, she presented the court with a meticulously organized case file containing every authorization obtained before the operation began, including a judicially approved surveillance order permitting the placement of cameras along the highway corridor. She produced signed documentation proving that her role as a decoy had been reviewed and approved by federal oversight attorneys weeks before the incident occurred, eliminating any claim that the encounter had been spontaneous or improperly authorized. She laid out an unbroken chain of custody for every piece of physical and digital evidence collected that night, ensuring that nothing could later be dismissed as tampered with or mishandled. The defense attorney, who had built his reputation on finding procedural gaps large enough to collapse a prosecution, found none to exploit. Every warrant had been properly filed. Every camera placement had proper judicial sign-off. Every step of Nyla's involvement had been documented, reviewed, and approved through channels designed specifically to prevent the kind of challenge he was now attempting to raise. As the hearing progressed, his objections grew shorter and less confident, until eventually he requested a private conference with his client, rather than continuing to argue in open court. Reporters covering the hearing later noted that his tone shifted entirely once the documentation was placed on record, moving from combative certainty to visible unease within the span of a single afternoon. It was during a subsequent hearing that the full scope of the investigation finally became public, revealing that Travis Holloway represented only a single strand within a corruption network that had operated for more than a decade. Federal prosecutors laid out connections between certain police officers, a group of local businessmen, several defense attorneys willing to guide cases toward favorable outcomes for a price, and intermediaries who facilitated the flow of money between all parties involved. Evidence obtained through months of financial tracking revealed payments disguised as consulting fees, real estate transactions structured to hide their true purpose, and offshore accounts used to launder proceeds from the very smuggling operations Travis had claimed to be fighting. The network had quietly profited from both sides of the law, protecting genuine criminal operations while punishing innocent people who happened to be convenient targets for manufactured arrests. Federal agents coordinated a series of simultaneous arrests across the city, timed to prevent any warning from reaching remaining members of the network before they could destroy evidence or flee. News crews arrived at courthouses, office buildings, and private residences throughout the morning, capturing images of handcuffed businessmen being led from glass office towers alongside officers being escorted from the same precinct where they had once patrolled with impunity. The scale of the operation stunned residents who had trusted their local police department for years, unaware of the rot quietly spreading beneath its public image. Community members who had once celebrated Travis as a decorated officer now watched footage of his arrest with a mixture of anger and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the hero they thought they knew with the man revealed in the evidence. Walter Prentice, the businessman whose import company had long served as a front for the smuggling operation, was arrested at his home just after 7 in the morning, still in his robe, when agents knocked on his door with a warrant in hand. His attorney later argued that Prentice had simply been a victim of circumstance, unaware of what his associates were truly moving through his warehouses. But financial records told a different story entirely. Investigators traced more than $4 million flowing through his company over a period of nearly 6 years, disguised as consulting fees and equipment purchases that never actually existed. A defense attorney named Nyla Voss, who had represented several of the network's associates in unrelated cases over the years, was arrested the same morning, accused of steering favorable plea deals to protected individuals in exchange for a steady stream of referral payments funneled through his firm. The city's newspapers ran the story across their front pages for nearly 2 weeks straight, each new edition revealing another layer of the network that had operated largely unnoticed for over a decade. Editorials questioned how such an extensive operation had survived so many years without detection, and city council members demanded public hearings to determine what oversight failures had allowed it to persist for so long. Community advocacy groups, some of whom had spent years filing complaints against Travis and his associates, only to be dismissed or ignored, finally found themselves invited into rooms where their concerns were taken seriously. A woman named Marguerite Ellison, whose son had been wrongfully convicted based on planted evidence nearly 7 years earlier, stood before a city council session and read aloud the names of every person she believed deserved recognition for finally listening when she had once been told she was imagining things. Months later, the trial against Travis Holloway concluded in a courtroom packed with journalists, former victims, and department officials watching to see how deeply the consequences would extend. Prosecutors methodically presented the footage, the financial records, and testimony from cooperating officers, building a case so thorough that his attorney offered little more than procedural objections during closing arguments. The jury required only a matter of hours to reach a verdict, finding Travis guilty on charges including evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to commit fraud within a corrupt enterprise. The judge, addressing the courtroom before delivering the sentence, noted that few cases in her career had demonstrated such a complete betrayal of public trust by someone sworn to protect it. Travis received a sentence measured in years rather than months, a number large enough to ensure that the wrongful arrests and manufactured charges of his past would follow him far longer than they had ever followed his victims. Several individuals previously convicted based on his falsified evidence saw their cases reopened, their records expunged, and in a handful of cases, formal compensation, approved for years, lost to charges that should never have existed. Community advocates who had fought for years to draw attention to suspicious patterns within the department finally received the vindication they had long been denied, watching officials publicly acknowledge failures that had gone ignored for far too long. The department itself underwent a sweeping restructuring, with new oversight committees established specifically to prevent the kind of unchecked authority that had allowed Travis and his allies to operate for so long. Among those whose case was reopened was the teenager from 12 years earlier, now a grown man in his late 20s, who had spent nearly a decade carrying a record that had quietly closed doors to jobs, housing, and opportunities he never fully understood. He had been denied because of it. When investigators located him and explained that his original arrest had been part of the same pattern now being unraveled in court, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes before asking only one question, wanting to know whether anyone would believe him now, the way no one had believed him then. His record was cleared within weeks, and though nothing could fully return the years already lost, the formal acknowledgement carried a weight he had not expected to feel, a small but undeniable sense that the truth had finally caught up to what he always knew about that night. Marguerite Ellison's son received the same reversal, his conviction vacated in a brief hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes, but that she later described as the longest 20 minutes of her life, waiting to hear a judge say aloud what she had insisted for years. Lieutenant Cobb and Detective Ruiz each received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation, though neither avoided prison entirely, the courts making clear that cooperation could soften a sentence, but never erase the underlying betrayal of public trust. Walter Prentice received the longest sentence among the non-officers involved, the judge noting that his business had served as the financial backbone of an operation that caused measurable harm to the community for years, without interruption. Gerald Foss lost his license to practice law entirely, a professional death sentence that many considered fitting, given how many defendants he had quietly steered away from justice over the course of his career. One by one, as sentences were handed down across separate hearings throughout the following months, the city watched a structure that had once seemed untouchable, reduced to a list of names attached to prison terms and public disgrace. Outside the courthouse steps following the sentencing, a reporter approached Nyla as she walked toward a waiting vehicle, notebook raised, hoping for a comment on the case that had captivated the city for months. He asked her directly why she had remained so calm throughout an ordeal that would have shaken almost anyone else, especially during those tense hours inside a holding cell where she had no guarantee that her cover would hold or that the operation would succeed. Nyla paused for a moment, considering the question with the same unhurried patience she had shown from the very beginning of the encounter on that rainy highway. She told him that people who build their lives on lies almost always believe they remain in control of the story, convinced that fear alone will keep the truth buried forever. She added, before stepping into the vehicle, that such people consistently forget one simple and unavoidable fact. The truth requires only a single opportunity to surface, and once it does, it rarely goes back into hiding. The reporter scribbled the quote quickly, sensing immediately that it would become the defining line of coverage surrounding the entire case. Nyla offered no further comment, no dramatic flourish, no attempt to frame herself as anything other than someone who had simply done her job with discipline and patience. As the car door closed, the crowd outside the courthouse watched her go, uncertain whether they had just witnessed the end of a scandal or merely the closing chapter of a much longer story still unfolding behind the scenes. Autumn arrived quietly over Ashcroft in the weeks that followed, the summer's heaviness finally giving way to cooler mornings and skies that seemed to clear a little more each day. On one such morning, Nyla descended the courthouse steps for the final time in connection with the case, her federal team waiting nearby with a new folder already prepared for their next assignment. The rain that had once soaked the highway where everything began had long since stopped, replaced by pale sunlight breaking gently through thinning clouds. She did not look back at the courthouse behind her, nor did she linger to acknowledge the reporters still calling out questions from a respectful distance. She walked toward her waiting vehicle with the same measured calm she had carried since the very first night, a calm that had never been indifference, but discipline honed over years of learning to wait, watch, and act only when the moment was exactly right. Behind her, an entire corrupted network that had preyed upon a city for more than a decade lay fully exposed, dismantled through patience rather than force, through evidence rather than accusation. Somewhere across town, a new case file already awaited her attention, another set of names, another set of patterns, quietly forming into a pattern only she and her team could yet see. As her car pulled away from the courthouse and merged into the flow of morning traffic, the story of Travis Holloway closed not with vengeance, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice finally catching up to a lie that had run for far too long, proving once again that even the most carefully constructed deception eventually meets someone patient enough and prepared enough to bring it into the light.